What's going on, everybody? Tim from Tirfon Orbital. I have really been looking forward to doing a deep dive on the following install. This build was a first for me, so I do want to talk a little bit in depth about the chassis. I'll talk about my design process. But yeah, this is the first time that I have done what I call a mixed media chassis, right? So essentially I've got a main body resin chassis, but I've got some custom designed brass accents that are held in place with magnets and some post and hole stuff. So I'll talk about that when we do an up and close on the chassis. But this chassis is something very similar to some of the brass eco chassis that Goth3D offers. The taco shop is also doing something similar to this. So I've been meaning to dip my toes in the metal chassis game for a little while now. I've just really been looking for an excuse. I've been looking for a hilt with enough room for me to kind of spread my wings and design something. So this, fortunately for me, the client was okay with being my guinea pig for this particular install. This particular hilt, there was a lot of room in the grip. It's a very, very long grip. So I had a lot of room to play with, right? So like I said, this is the first time that I've ever done a chassis like this. It's not a full metal chassis. I'm hoping to maybe get to that point someday, but this is essentially just a regular resin chassis with some brass accents. I'm hesitant in calling it a metal master chassis. It really isn't. It's just a regular chassis with some really nice, a really nice brass battery cover. And there is also a crystal chamber in this chassis. So I've got a nice brass gate in front of that crystal chamber. So really, really proud of how this came out. So without further ado, let's come into Fusion and talk about this chassis. Okay, so here is the chassis for this particular build. So right off the bat, you'll notice that we've got two brass modules. We've got two brass parts here, okay? So the way I started with this design is I started with the main body of the chassis, right? So I took all of my internal diameter measurements. I made sure I had all of my tolerances correct, and I just started designing the chassis around the inside of the hilt. Then I came back and said, well, I've got plenty of room to get a crystal chamber in here. So I got my crystal chamber. And because the hilt is just a hair over 28 millimeters, I figured there was probably plenty of room to get some sort of battery cover that sits over the battery. And the only way that you can do that, you've got to make sure that your battery is sitting low enough to then add another couple of millimeters worth of brass for the brass cover, right? So it was a little interesting trying to design for this. I did also make sure before I sent the designs off to Craftcloud to be printed in brass, I printed test fit pieces just on my resin printer just to make sure that everything married together correctly and made sure it would slide in the grip with the brass cover on. So I wanted to make sure before I sent it off for finals that I had all my tolerance correct, right? So yeah, I built the chassis around the internal diameter measurements of the hilt. Then I cut out my battery tray, made sure it was sitting low enough so that I could then add another level for this battery cover. Added all my usual greeblies. I didn't get crazy with greeblies on this guy. I didn't know if it would be too much, right? So I didn't want a heavy amount of greeblies on both sides and then adding all of this brass stuff. Like I just didn't want it to be too busy, right? And I also wanted it to be a little bit structurally sound because we've got, I'm going a little bit deeper than I usually do with a 28 millimeter chassis because of this top cover. So I didn't want to get too crazy with greeblies. That being said, there's some around back that I put along the spine, right? So I've got a wire channel going along that spine. Plenty of room for my 3 leads. I've got my negative battery lead and my 2 speaker leads. They come up the bottom here and they go through this crystal chamber. God, I suck navigating in Fusion. So that spine, right, comes all the way up through this crystal chamber. This is essentially, this is hollow. It continues all the way up to where my Profi board is. So designing this crystal chamber was a little bit tricky as well, right? So doing crystal chamber chassis, especially in resin, I always feel a little nervous about cutting a lot of holes into a resin chassis like this. That said, when you've got your plasma gate on, it does essentially, it's like a load-bearing plasma gate, and it keeps everything a little bit more structurally sound. It keeps it, you know, a little bit, makes it a little bit more strong. So I've got this spine that comes up the back of the crystal chamber. I can bring my leads up to where the Profi board is. These holes that you see here on the side and these two holes here are for 3mm magnets. Now here's another thing that I've noticed when doing chassis from Goth, specifically, you know, a lot of magnets, and they're always 1mm, 2mm magnets. They're a pain to work with. They're a pain to glue. If you glue them in incorrectly, they're a huge pain in the butt to get out. So I wanted to use large magnets just to avoid all of that headache. So all of the magnets in this build are 3mm magnets, right? So I've got 4 along each side. It's total overkill, but I've got 4 along each side for the battery cover, and then I've got 2 here for that crystal plasma gate or whatever, right? Above the crystal, I've got a single neopixel. I did put a real quartz crystal in this crystal chamber, and then making our way up. This is a tilted Profi board setup. The way that I designed the chassis is such that when you unscrew the grip, this Profi board sits just below the threading. So you don't have to remove the Profi board to get to your USB. You can just pull the SD card out with a pair of tweezers if need be. All of the way up top here, there is an indentation for a 6x6 red tactile button. This is a single button setup in this particular hilt. So there is a very, very nicely machined plunger switch that serves as your single button switch. And that's it. Really, really happy with how these pieces came out. So, I mean, right off the bat, you'll assume, I mean, even I did, this is really just a nod to some of the other really, really high-end chassis designers out there, like Rick from Goth3D has been somebody that has always been an inspiration. I've wanted to do something like this for a long time. I did not want to directly copy his design aesthetic. However, that being said, I mean, there's a lot of some touches of Martin Beyer in here. You know, I pull a lot of inspiration from a lot of the designers that are out there. It's hard to do your own aesthetic without directly copying somebody, right? So I try to do very, very subtle nods to some of those other really, really talented designers out there, right? I'm really happy with how this came out, though. It was a very simple process. I thought it would be really, really complicated to get these two parts to marry correctly, but making sure that I printed off some test prototype parts and making sure everything was final before sending it off to printer. You know, I'm just really happy with the way it came out, right? So anyway, enough about me. Let's talk about this hilt. Let's come up top. Okay, so this is the Valkyrie from Vaults of Valhalla. Now, if I am not mistaken, the etching and powder coat was also done by Carl from Vaults of Valhalla. This is an absolutely beautiful, beautiful hilt. I actually have another Valkyrie in line for install, and it too has an absolutely just beautiful, this is artwork in my opinion. Honestly, this is all art. Just the way that it's painted, the color scheme, the etch, it's just beautiful. So the Valkyrie was created with etching and customization in mind. It's a lot like the Subversion in that it's just a great blank canvas for etching, and this is just beautiful. So the more I see of these Valkyries out there, the more I want to do some sort of custom etching and powder coating on one for myself. I mean, obviously I'd commission that out to the professionals, but they're just, this is beautiful. It's an absolutely beautiful hilt. So let's talk about how to use this guy. So this is a unthreadable grip. The pommel also unthreads, but you don't need to do that for this particular install. So the whole grip comes off. Here is the chassis. So these are the main body of the chassis I've printed off in resin. And then here are those brass pieces, right? So again, like I really wanted to get some meaty, large magnets on this. It is complete overkill. I probably could have gotten away with just doing 2 on each side. But yeah, I'm really happy with how that came out. 28 millimeter speaker at the bottom here. This is a 28 millimeter dark side bass speaker from Smuggler's Outpost. And our Profi board is peaking just below the threads here. And that's it. So let's talk about how to use this guy. Take your battery. Spring side is your negative. Flat part of your battery towards the speaker. Then you want to hit that kill switch. So there's that crystal. The crystal is its own blade in the config, and then obviously we've got our main blade in the config as well. So once you get your battery in, put your battery cover on, slide your grip on, so it is a little bit of a tight squeeze. Let's turn this off. Screw your grip back on until it stops. You're ready to go. Man, this is an awesome hilt. Let's come down to the bottom. Okay. I mean, this hilt sounds really good. It sounds really good.
Ancient integration.
Man. I think I need one.
I am no Jedi.
Great hilt. Okay, so let's put a blade in this guy. Okay, so this is a 1-inch blade holder. You want to rest your blade on those PCB pins. There is a very small set screw, M3 set screw, around one side of that emitter. Just tighten that set screw down until it's hugging that blade, and you're ready to go. It's a really phenomenally sounding hilt.
Inquisitorious.
Being an inquisitor.
Sister. Don't talk back to your elders, child.
One more. Man, sounds so good. All right, enough of that. So that's all I got. I am really happy with how the chassis came out in this build. So I will probably be doing a little more of the hybrid metal chassis. I hope to someday get to a full metal build. But yeah, I'm really happy with how this came out, right? To the client, thank you very much for being my guinea pig for this particular install. Thank you for trusting me with this beautiful hilt. Again, like seeing hilts with this level of etching and powder coating, it's almost I mean, some of these hilts are like functional sculpture and art anyhow, but seeing artwork being etched into hilts like this, it's really, really nice. I I'm probably going to end up getting one now. But yeah, just a great hilt. It's a great sounding hilt. So yeah, super happy with the result. To the viewers, if anyone has any questions about my process here or what it's like working with Craftcloud, please do not be a stranger. And that's it, right? Thank you very much for the support, everybody. And with that being said, may the force be with you always. Have a good one.